Good morning to everyone, and welcome to the webinar. You want me to do what? Part 1, Adding Points to Constructed Responses. This webinar is being brought to you by Florida IPDE, the Institute for the Professional Development of Adult Educators. And on behalf of both Susan and me, we'd like to welcome you.
As we get started this morning, we want to really thank you for being here with us. We understand that you have busy days and busy schedules, and what we hope to do with all of this is to provide you with some really timely information to help you as you're working with different students within your classroom. Here's what we're going to do over the course of about the next 45 minutes or so. We're going to take a look back at the scoring rubric. Got to remember, our things have changed now. We're also going to be looking at where there's a problem here between the comparing those scorable zeros to level 2 writing. And then we're going to dig a little bit deeper into assessing effective writing. As Bonnie said just a few minutes ago in the intro, we actually are doing, this is part 1, and there will be a follow-up to this so that we can dig even deeper into those different strategies that will be used. But first, let's just take a moment and talk just a little bit about what's happening at the GED testing service and what they're having to say about writing. There's been a little bit of confusion around the country because people are saying, you know, my students are writing better, they're doing much better work, but they're still not scoring points when it comes to these writing samples on reasoning through language arts or social studies and science, and I don't quite understand why that particular thing is happening. So the GED testing service has really been taking a look at what has been going on, and a big part of this comes back to the fact that students just aren't understanding constructed responses and what all that entails. This is a major shift for us as adult educators to move from having students write fairly simple opinion pieces to now moving into something that is called argumentative writing and a constructed response, which means that we're having students go through and that they're actually having to read something and then respond to it. So the couple things that you need to be aware of as we're going through. Constructed responses are a much better way of directly assessing students' writing skills, and not only that, but their thinking skills. How do they problem solve, and not just problem solve in math, as we always talk about, but how do they think through problems and resolve those issues? And there are 4 constructed response items that students are going to have to do on this 2014 test. The first of these, we know that's the big one. In reasoning through language arts, it's 45 minutes and about 20% of the test. Think about that. That's a substantial amount of time that students will have in order to read something, analyze what they've read, and then respond to that. In social studies, 25 minutes, and again, about 20% of the test. And then last but not least, we have 2 writing samples that are in science, and those are considered short answer items. They take about 10 minutes each, and both of them combined represent about 15% of the test. But more than that, this is not just about having students be successful on a test. We want students to be successful as they go on after the test. And so being able to do those constructed responses is going to take and really make a difference for them as they're moving through. So Bonnie, how about let's talk a little bit about reasoning through language arts and those constructed responses and kind of what that means.
Okay, Susan, let's look at RLA. reasoning language arts. The extended response on RLA requires that our students, our test takers, use skills of evidence. Can they find accurate and valid evidence to support the information that they are trying to prove? It also requires skills of how they express meaning and, of course, that wonderful thing called language conventions and usage. If we look at the formatting of a standard prompt in RLA, it tells the test taker that in their response they have to analyze. That's a whole different skill, a much higher level skill than we're used to. But they need to analyze both positions that are presented in the text or text. And they need to determine which one's best supported based upon relevant and specific evidence from the article or articles. And they need to support their response, connect it. That type of a prompt is the same prompt that you're going to see throughout all of the RLA writing samples. Now, quite honestly, the subjects may change, but the basic format of the prompt will not. So that's RLA. But if that's RLA, what does social studies look like? Well, social studies looks very similar in its extended response, because in social studies it requires that the test taker not only have skills in reading and writing in a social studies context, but can that student, can that test taker apply social studies concepts? And we're talking about the big ideas. Now, how will the test assess that? Through a prompt that's going to look similar to this, where it tells the test taker in his or her response the test taker needs to develop an argument about how the author's position reflects an enduring issue expressed in the excerpt. An enduring issue is, again, those big ideas of social studies. And then the test taker needs to incorporate relevant and specific evidence from the excerpt, from the article, as well as the test taker's own knowledge of that enduring issue to support the analysis. Throughout both RLA and social studies, you've seen some words over and over. Analysis, evidence, argument, those are the types of skills that we need to incorporate into our adult ed classroom.
Bonnie, let me ask you a question. If we have people who are saying, okay, all right, it's fine to have, this whole thing of integrating reading and writing, but what do you mean by an enduring issue or a big idea? What's an example of something like that?
To me, a big idea in social studies would be those freedoms that are identified in the Bill of Rights. All of those freedoms in that First Amendment, those are the kinds of things: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, minority rights, majority rights. Those types of things are big ideas to me.
And so if we, as instructors, get into the classroom and we say, okay, I really need to make sure my students have some understanding of some key historic documents like the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. If they have kind of that general understanding of what those are, that should help them as they go to do this extended response when it comes to social studies.
I definitely agree with you, Susan, and if we can go that next step with students and take those major rights that we all have and have them connect them to things which are occurring in today's world through the newspaper, through the internet, then they will really be ready to apply what they know about it, their own knowledge, to support their analysis.
Okay, so likewise now we move over to science, and are we going to have to know everything when it comes to science, or can we do the kind of big ideas when we start talking about science?
We definitely can do the big ideas, because when we're looking at those two short answers, you can see the type of information that's required. Because here again, students need to be able to have the skills of reading and writing in a science context. So here again, they have to develop a logical argument. They have to use the evidence to present a line of reasoning. And because we know there are two short answers, what we're going to see in this particular test or module is that one of the questions is going to require that the test taker read something and apply an understanding of a major science concept. Again, a big idea. But the other short answer is always going to test experimental design. So that says to me that in my classroom, what I really need to do is have my students actually conduct experiments where they have to identify the research question or the hypothesis, where they have to actually design that investigation, figuring out how they're going to do it and what data they're going to collect, and then that they justify their line of reasoning. Once they have the data, how are they going to determine whether their hypothesis was correct or incorrect? That's something we've not done before. And there again, science experiments do not have to be difficult. They do not have to require lots of equipment. They can be as simple as determining which plant grows quicker, or which fruit ripens faster, whether it's in the sunlight or whether it's in the dark or whether it's in a container. Those are the kinds of things that we all can do in the classroom that will really help our students understand those basics of science and to be able to answer short answers better. So Susan.
Having taken into consideration what you've just said through RLA and social studies and now science, then there are some real similarities between these. I have to have some higher order thinking skills. That's going to help me as I'm trying to work through my analysis. I really have to look at that overall content of that module itself. I mean, because everything is reflected there. I need this thing called close reading, which really means that I'm not skimming and scanning, but I'm actually reading the text, and from that text I'm able to extract meaning, and I can find my whatever my prompt is telling me to do. I can find the evidence that supports my argument. I can do all of those things, and I also have to make sure I'm kind of bringing my background knowledge in. So that's going to give me an opportunity to get a higher score. So really, if I have a process for working through these constructed responses, it's going to help me across all three areas, not just one.
Susan, you're so correct, but if you're like me, the first question that would pop into my mind is, you want me to do what? Because what we're talking about now is not only you want me to teach a process, but you also want me to teach some content knowledge, and as an instructor, you want me to recognize what's effective writing that's argumentative and what's less effective writing. Am I correct?
That's true, and I think those eyes on that child are about like the eyes we've seen on some teachers as we've been going through and looking at some of these things. So let's take a look at what we mean by why argument really matters, because we are talking about having to do argumentative writing. And so if we do that, then that's going to make a difference. So when we argue in writing, we're really using the ability to support a claim. We've got valid reasoning, and that reasoning is based on evidence that we've extracted from what we've read. So when we have something that, in this case, we want to score, we want to get a maximum of 2 for developing an argument on that part of the trait, then we know that we have really analyzed, used our critical thinking skill, and we've been able to go through and identify that evidence and make sure it's valid. We've been logical in what we're trying to do, and we really have put together the strengths and weaknesses of the counterclaims, because it's not just about making a claim. Sometimes it's about showing why the other side is not right.
I think that's new, isn't it, Susan?
Well, it is. I mean, it's a whole different paradigm. I don't necessarily like a paradigm shift, that term, but at the same time, we're really changing our whole way of looking at what we're doing when we're writing.
And you know, GED testing service shared with us that there really is nothing to fear but fear itself. And according to GED testing service, they say that even test takers with lower skill levels, they can attain points on the constructed response items. And remember, constructed response can be either extended, the reasoning through language arts and the social studies, or it can be the short answer. But right now, let's talk about reasoning through language arts. Scoring a 1 on trait 3, that's grammar and sentence structure and fluidity of the writing. To score a 1, which again would be multiplied by 2, so that's actually 2 points, requires about 7 to 10 lines of mostly grammatically correct writing that flows. Please know that right now our students aren't doing that. So they're not editing and revising well enough to have grammatically correct writing and to have fluidity or different sentence structure that reads so smoothly. The same way with trait 2, which is that development of ideas, organizational structure, the progression of ideas throughout a writing sample. And there again, GED testing service tells us that to score a 1 on trait 2 requires a clear organizational structure, more than just a paragraph or multiple paragraphs, but whether those ideas flow and whether they're connected from one idea to the other. So, you know, that really looks easy enough. So why are students not doing it?
But if you think about it, Bonnie, what is it that's happening for our students? Many of our students, as they're going through, they're not even spending 45 minutes in the reasoning through language arts to write their writing sample. So that says to me that they're not taking the time that they're allotted to go through, and especially if you're looking at just having to have 7 to 10 grammatically correct lines in order to get some points off of trait 3, they're not spending the time to do any editing and revising, because that should be a fairly easy pickup. So we need to make sure, as we're out there and we're working with teachers and in the classroom, we have to say, look, emphasize to teachers and emphasize to your students that they need to take advantage of the time that they're given.
Very definitely. So let's look at a few basics of scoring, just kind of a reminder of what these are. If students get non-scorable zeros, a non-scorable 0 on their writing sample, it really does talk that there's special conditions that exist, such as they've either copied text exclusively from the source text, or they've been totally off topic, or maybe since they were taking it in English, they didn't write their response in English, or of course, if they took it in Spanish, they didn't write their response in Spanish. A non-scorable 0 also is when something is just totally incomprehensible. Either a test taker just wrote the same word over and over, or what he or she says just makes absolutely no sense, or it was left blank. That's determined to be a non-scorable 0, as opposed to when we look at a scorable 0, which means they did something. Susan and I like to say that scorable 0 is very similar to the 2 off of the old essay, where it was marginal at best. Just remember that on this new test, the 2014 GED test, there is no specific score to pass extended response, but rather the ER score is added to the rest of the RLA test. However, having said that, it is really, really important to note that the highest weighted score possible on extended response is 12 points. Remember, that's about 20% of the test, so it's really, really an important item, not only for this test, but of course we want to be able to say our students can write well, both in the real world situations that they experience daily, as well as when they head into post-secondary education. But what does it take to get us beyond that scorable 0 that we're seeing so much of? Well, Susan, how about taking us through and let's look at the dimensions of those 3 traits. Let's dig a little bit deeper.
Okay, that sounds good, because we know we have 3 traits. All right, let's start out now looking at trait 1, and that's really that creation of arguments and the use of evidence. So within that, we have several different dimensions, and kind of think of those like, subcomponents within this. Dimension 1 really talks about your argument. Did you develop a claim? And is your argument, it should focus on having, see there's that word again, close reading and an analysis of the source text itself. So we have dimension 1, all about the text-based argument. Now let's move to dimension 2. And now we're looking at not text-based argument, but we've already got our argument. Now let's get the evidence that goes with that. So it is all about the establishment of criteria from the evaluation of the text, and to be able to cite that text as we're coming through. So we have our argument, our claim, then we have the evidence that backs up that claim, and then as we move on and we take a look at dimension 3, we're talking about how we analyzed and evaluated that. It's about taking a look at what you've read and looking at the validity of that author's or multiple authors' arguments with the source text. It's about having criteria for how you evaluate that text, and also the text-based evidence to see how connected that evidence is and how valid and reliable that is back to what our argument is as we go through. Okay, so we're going to take a look at 2 things now coming up. One, we're going to look at and see this is how students should be setting up for that creation of the argument and the use of evidence. And if you take a look at this particular one, you can see what the student has laid out very clearly as they go through. This article presents arguments from both supporters and critics of daylight saving time. Both sides provide good support. So the writer here is acknowledging that there is evidence on both sides, but the argument against daylight saving time is stronger and more complete. So now we have the claim. And interestingly enough, that claim is not sitting there as the first sentence or the last sentence, kind of in the middle. But you can notice what the student has done in order to set up a strong claim coming through. Now, this is how we'd like to see students do things. Let's take a look at what we're getting from some students coming through and how we're going to have to make some adjustments. So let's go to what we see too many times, and instead of what we just saw, a nice strong claim, let's take a look at the next one. And so Bonnie, if you can move us to the next slide.
We hope so.
There we go. Okay, take a look at the way this student has written this. In my way, it's good because in DST is good for a lot of people. Well, first of all, in the very first sentence, this is getting fairly convoluted, and I'm not exactly sure what this student is trying to tell me. I don't see that clear claim. So let's see if it's a little bit further down. The studies have indicated traveling home from work or school in daylight is safer. Okay, that's still not a claim. Nearly 3 decades of research. In everything, new things takes time to adjust. So as I've looked through these different pieces, I'm not seeing a nice, clear claim that lays out for one position based on what the author has said, not my opinion, but the author. in this. So that's one thing that we have to be really cautious as we're moving through, that our students are laying out a claim that's reasonable, that we could agree or disagree with, but that we can understand here is the point that all of this is going to be built from. Okay.
Susan,
So,
you know, one more thing I saw here is this student who got a scorable 0 never analyzed or evaluated. Remember in the stronger one, that student really was evaluating that it was good support, it was stronger, it was more complete. There was an evaluation of the evidence there. That may be a problem that we're seeing with students, that they really are not evaluating or analyzing.
I think that's true. Basically, when I look at this particular response, I just see a lot of different, quote, stuff from what is in the article itself. I'm really not seeing any connection between those things and how everything relates. So this is something that we have to be really cognizant of as we're going through and working with our students, because we have to go beyond merely having some statement from the test taker that agrees with it, a single statement or stance. That's not enough as we're moving through. And it has to be more than just using quotes. That's one of the things Bonnie and I joke all the time about, the fact that, for many of our students, quotes are just like commas. If one comma is good, 6 commas are better. And so we have to make sure that the students are not just quoting directly what comes from the text, but that they really have analyzed, so that the information they're coming through is really supporting what they're trying to say in their claim itself. So let's take a look at a couple more things here. Take a look at this first one. I mean, between the two positions in this article, the one against daylight saving time is better supported. I mean, that is just right there in front of your face to say, this is my claim. It is just as clear as can be. Look at that second one underneath there. Same thing. The argument in favor of DST is better supported. Again, as Bonnie was talking about, using some of that analysis as we're coming through to show those pieces. Those are nice, clear claims or stances. But if we take a look at see what some students are doing, they say daylight savings time is a great thing. Well, in this particular case, who is the they that they are referring to as they go through? And if you take a look at the next one, the changing to daylight savings time twice a year is quite confusing to a lot of people. That sounds more to me like an opinion than it is in terms of setting up that claim based on what the writers have actually said. So look at the differences and make sure that you're watching that students have that ability to set that nice clear claim as they're going through. Okay, so we've done that part. Let's take a look a little bit deeper and a little bit further. So Bonnie, what is all this stuff about analyzing?
Well, to go beyond a scorable 0, students really do need to either analyze or evaluate the issue or the argument, which means they have to cite evidence that's going to support their message. You saw previously that students were setting up in a good claim the fact that they were going to show that the evidence was stronger, more accurate, more reliable. Again, that student had evaluated the information as he or she read, a really important skill that we probably need to incorporate much more in our classroom through close reading. The response also has to show evidence that the test taker is engaged with the text. Well, what does engaging with the text really mean? It means that the student is doing more than just summarizing, but rather through analyzation and evaluation, the student has figured out something about that text that he or she can write about. Okay, that sounds a little bit esoteric, so let's take a look at a couple samples of actual student writing. What we're talking about is that we want students to be able to see. And give me a moment here. The left-hand side. We want them to be able to see. It says, in the argument for daylight savings time, it seems that the pro-daylight savings time position has won. Nice, clear claim. Then this particular test taker talks about the first article, that it brings up several improvements in the daily lives. Again, they've analyzed, they've put it together. They've not just merely stated it's done this, this, and this, which is summarization. The article uses studies and large-scale research. Nowhere does it talk about large-scale research specifically, but this particular test taker has looked at the article well and looked at all of the different types of research and has evaluated that it is large-scale, as opposed to the second article where it's smaller scale studies. So this particular test taker is not only analyzed and evaluated, but he or she is engaged with the text and has gone that next step to connecting that information. Instead of, if you look at the right-hand passage, it talks about the changing to daylight savings time twice a year is quite confusing. We saw that earlier. It's a very generic stance. Person can become upset when they forget to change their clock. More accidents can happen in rushing when you forget to change all of your clocks. Again, what this student is doing is merely summarizing information in a very personal way rather than engaging with the text itself. This is the difference between, on the left-hand side of your screen, a 2 as opposed to a scorable 0. But there's another thing of going beyond that scorable 0. And that is what we've alluded to, the fact that responses should not be composed of just a summary of the passage. We need to go beyond that information. And again, it should not be personal. It is not an I. So we want them to take that more formal stance. So what do we mean by that? Susan, let's take a look at both summarization and personal information.
Okay, so if we take a look at that first one there, if there are arguments to be, if those are the arguments that are made, then people just need to be more responsible if they are having trouble adjusting with the time change. You know, it's just coming back and doing a quick summary, but even more than that, it's kind of gotten a little personal in it. As you go through, you know, if they're having trouble, well, then you just need to be more responsible about it. And then look at the personal information. Back when it was thought of, it made sense, but times have changed, and now it's time to not have it. That comes back again to that my own opinion. I think or I feel as you're going through. Even though the word I is not there, it's very much inferred that that's a personal information coming through from that. So those are just a few things that as you go through and you're working with students, you really need to be cognizant of taking apart. I mean, we really are, instead of taking, as we did in the past, this holistic version or holistic view of their writing samples. Now we're really analyzing what our students are saying and how they're responding. It's only through that process and being aware of those individual pieces that we can make sure that our students are writing at a level that is going to afford them points on the test, but more importantly, that foundation, so as they move on into post-secondary or the workplace, that they've got those skills. So I think we have a resource that we're going to be able to share with you about evaluating an argument. And so Bonnie's going to pull that particular one. And here's just an argument graphic organizer. This is one of the materials that you can pull down and print and use as you want to. But we often know that working with graphic organizers can make a big difference for some students. Now, there are others who really don't like having graphic organizers, but if this is something that you would like to use, then certainly feel free to do so. And you can see it has a claim. After you've read after reading an argument text, use a table to evaluate the author's reasoning. So claim 1, is the claim relevant? Okay, then tell why. And then, is the claim valid? And tell why. Because as you move through text, sometimes you're going to see multiple arguments that are laid out. And this would be a good way, especially when students are working with something like daylight savings time, where it's kind of a pro-con, that they could look at those different claims to see which one had the more relevant information and which one was more valid. So that just gives you a tool that you can use in the classroom working with students, really to get their mind thinking of how I need to do this. So we've done that, but let's take a look at trait 2, because trait 2 is one of those that everyone thought, wow, this is going to be easy for students because it's really about organizing and getting data going. But we don't have, we're still finding that students are not able to do that as they're moving through. So Bonnie, you want to pick up from here? Okay, so I don't hear Bonnie at this moment, so what I'll do is
We're
start
having
going.
a technical difficulty with the PowerPoint.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, we are back. Trait 2 is the development of ideas and structure, and we're looking again at those dimensions or those major categories of what does it mean development of ideas and structure. The first one is depth and breadth. Are they fully developed ideas? Again, that's very different than organization that we see in paragraphs or putting paragraphs together. But has the test taker, has the student set up an idea and then extended it with additional evidence, additional connections? The next one is coherence, that building from one idea to another. Oftentimes our students like to use lists or basically sentences that might as well be lists. What they're looking for in this particular dimension is, do the ideas connect? Is there fluidity? Sometimes we call those transitional devices as we go through. But does it move from one idea to another quite smoothly? The other thing is we're looking at dimensions is organization. Again, are the ideas logical? Not only are they fluid as they go through, but do they go into a logical fashion? And of course, we've talked about the fact we want a formal style and an objective tone. In writing for an argument style, it would be third person rather than first, and there again, it's not about my ideas or my feeling, but about the ideas of the author or authors of the text that I've just read. And finally, is the word choice appropriate? Is it advanced enough to be called high school graduation level? There again, we're looking at words which are appropriate for the use of formal argumentative writing, and we're looking for a more advanced vocabulary. For those of you who have been with Susan and me before, you know that oftentimes we use a list called the academic word list. These are words that are much more appropriate for our students to be using than the word lists that are the very basic ones, such as the Fry or Dolch. So, 5 dimensions, looking at development of ideas and structure. So what does that look like in actual writing style? Well, if I'm looking at trait 2 at a quality writing, an effective writing, my development of ideas and structure may look something like this. It says, supporters of DST cite 3 of research that shows an 8 to 11% reduction in pedestrian-related accidents and 6 to 10% reduction in vehicle-only crashes after the spring shift to DST. That sentence flows. Now, some of you may have determined, oh, but Bonnie, there was a grammar error there. Remember, we're looking at trait 2, not trait 3, development of ideas and structure. Then we've got those nice transition words. However, they've not indicated the risk. Those against the use, cite one study that showed, again, a nice flow. Effective use of words, transitional phrases. This is what we want to see. As opposed to something like this. Prose daylight savings time, again, we're not going to worry about the editing and revision issues. We're looking at flow. But because the student has really listed sentences, because the transition is not there, because the progression of ideas are not connected, this is what we're looking at as scoreable 0. Yes, it's on topic. Yes, it provides information. But there again, it's marginal at best. We can look at tone, style, and word choice as well. If you'll notice here, this particular one has a nice formal style. Both arguments have been backed by reputable studies. Wow, reputable. Wouldn't have you liked your students to have used the word reputable, Susan?
Absolutely, and if I go down a little bit further, I would have been real happy with the proponent as well. Again, as Bonnie said earlier, this is about students having a vocabulary that is indicative of someone who's going to be a graduating high school senior. We should have that higher order vocabulary as we're moving through, instead of what you see on the right-hand side where they claim that the more sunlight the better. There's an interesting tone to that as well as the word choice itself. But if you look at the next one, if those are the arguments that are made, then people just need to be more responsible. I mean, we're back again to that personal opinion. But then also we have to look at those transitional devices, how the specificity and also elaboration. And in that first column, you can see where that student very much has used transitional devices, has really been specific in what he's saying, and is elaborating on that information. You know, as opposed to having a student who goes through and says for those who support, they claim that the more sunlight the better. Those are the different things where the student, there's no true elaboration within this. And again, it impacts that sense of organization, that sense of flow itself. So there are some resources that you can use in order to work with this. And so one of the things that you may want to consider using, and this is another handout that you can download, this is about connecting ideas using transitional words and phrases. Now, we've talked for a number of years, and everyone has, about using transitional words, but unfortunately we really haven't expanded out the way that we should. We have included more along the lines of next and first and finally and in conclusion, but there are a wealth of words out there that show other different types of things, and that's what we're going to want to do. So this is one area where you may want to help build your students' vocabulary and how they're using transitional words and phrases. And as we said, you can just download this one after the webinar itself if you haven't already done so. So we have one more trait that we need to take a look at, and that comes back to that good old English grammar. They have a little bit more technical term for it, but English grammar. So let's talk a little bit about the dimensions that are included here. And it's not just about, do I have an understanding of commas and capitals and that. It's about sentence structure. Dimension 1 comes into looking at, can my students use a variety of different types of sentences in order to make that writing more interesting? Think about the writing you've seen in the past where it's these little, short, simple sentences and it just goes on, and you think, oh my gosh, this is so boring. What you want to look for are students who can do simple, compound, and complex, depending on what that they need as they're moving through. And then as we take a look at Dimension 2, that comes back to your grammar pieces and to standard English conventions. You may want to take a look at the resource guide that goes along with Reasoning Through Language Arts and see the very specific things that they're looking for in that standard English, like in dealing with commas, dealing with in punctuation. There are a number of different things that are listed, but you'll want to take a look at those. And then as we continue on, we have that fluency, whether we're grammatically and syntactically correct as we move through, which shows that proficiency. And take a look at that phrase there, through a writing long enough. Long enough meaning if I only have a few sentences, and in those few sentences I have a bunch of quotes, it's going to be hard to evaluate my writing for trait 3 because I'm not using my words and my understanding. So I have to be cognizant of that.
So what does it look like?
This. Yeah, as we take a look at this particular one first, looking at this one, just take a second to look through and notice what you see within this. This article presents arguments from both supporters and critics of daylight saving time who disagree about the practice's impact on energy consumption and safety. Both sides provide good support for their position, but the argument against is stronger and more complete. Look at the way these sentences are done and how complex some of these sentences actually are in moving through the process. If we could only have our students write at this level, we would be so pleased, and I know all of you would be so pleased in order to see that. But instead, what we're often finding as we go through is something that looks like this. In my way, it's good because, and DST is good for a lot of people. Well, first of all, that's really hard to figure out exactly what the student was trying to say. The studies has indicated from the very beginning we're going to see a number of different errors as we move through. Now, the expectation by the GED testing service is not that everything is going to be perfect. Remember, this is writing that's done and considered to be a draft. It's considered on demand, meaning I have a limited amount of time to do it, so I'm not asking for perfect. But I am asking for something that has limited errors as opposed to that continuing errors, which eventually makes it very hard to understand what the writer is trying to do. So we need to be cognizant of that and work on those, but we're going to have to work on it from a standpoint of having students learn grammar in a more contextual manner as opposed to just learning a bunch of disparate rules. Those are the things we're going to have to work on. So as we move from there, we've got to think about how we're going to work with different things, including things like sentence structure. And that's one that you're going to want to focus on as well. Helping students build out and understand how they can add that variety into their writing as opposed to having the same type of sentences over and over again. The first position would be the benefits of daylight savings time. The study also talked. The next point, those are things that if we can move students into that more sense of variety within their sentence structure, so much the better.
And we want to look at standard English conventions. As Susan indicated, it's not that it has to be a perfect writing sample. It is on-demand draft writing. However, if our students are taught to revise and edit within contextualized materials, and that they put aside that little bit of time at the end of their 45 minutes or their 25 minutes or even their 10-minute short writing samples to really read through and to fix all those little errors that just occur when we write, so that students, again, are putting quotation marks in when they need to, are putting commas in, the kinds of things that we teach in our classroom. They just need to enact because we want to see this instead of this, where if the studies are correct, I would say they are right. I can't even understand what they've read. And had this particular student, test taker, reread some of these sentences, he or she, I'm sure, would have said, whoa, that's not what I meant or what I wanted to see. So a little tip for you, and this little tip comes from Graf and Bergstein. And what this is something called sentence starters or sentence frames. Oftentimes our students just need to know what format is formal writing. What should I be saying? And so these sentence starters and frames, which again you can download, will give you some ideas. We don't want students to use them forever, but it's a nice beginning. So if they want to make predictions, these are some of the words. And instead, of course, saying I predict, we can use the author. If this happens, then that. Boy, that sounds like science to me. But sentence frames are a nice beginning to get students into writing more effectively in what trait 3 is asking for. Having said that, we all need to remember, and we're going to talk about a process for teaching argumentative writing. For those of you who have been with Susan and me in constructed response workshops, we've talked a lot about process, but we need to dig deeper beyond the process and into those further sub-steps of what argumentative writing looks like, and we will do that in the next webinar. But what we want to leave you with is, since we're in Florida, we figured we had to have something that was Floridian. So a nice little acronym about argumentative writing, and it's called PEELS, as in orange peels. First of all, a student or test taker needs to make a strong claim or thesis statement. The test taker needs to support that claim or thesis with evidence and examples. From there, though, the test taker needs to connect or explain how and why that evidence supports the claim. And of course, we all know we want the linkages, linking from one point to the next point, from the last point to the next point, and definitely a nice formal style. So an easy acronym to remember when students say, but what should I be writing? How does argumentative writing look different than some of the other writing styles I've used? Remember PEELS: point, evidence, explanation, link, and style. That will be the first step. But as we said, we will have another webinar where we actually dig deeper into the strategies for teaching argumentative writing skills. We'll provide you with all types of graphic organizers for each of the steps in teaching and some examples of what effective writing should look like. So tune in for that one on Tuesday, June 16th at 3, and that's 3 Eastern Time when we will be live, and that will be part 2. But before you join us again, you may say, but where can I get more information? Where in the world, Susan, can I see more examples of not only these kinds of writings, but also some ideas for my classroom?
Well, there are a number of different places where you can find things, and you're going to want to make sure that, first of all, always check out Florida Tech Net so that you can go in, take a look at all the materials that are there. If you're not aware, there's a handbook out there for GED preparation. There are lesson plans. I repeat, lesson plans. Isn't that a wonderful thing to have lesson plans and I don't have to worry about developing? And there are other resources there as well. Plus, you need to make sure you're aware of the Florida GED frameworks, and those are listed on the Florida DOE website. And then one other place you will always want to be checking, and make sure you're signed up for their newsletters that come out as well, is the GED testing service. There are so many different resources that are available on that website, can make a huge difference, because the first thing we all need to do as educators is have an understanding of what are the true changes. What does this really look like? And I will say that the GED testing service has given us a ton of information this time, much more so than we've ever had in the past. So take advantage of Florida TechNet, the Florida DOE website, and also the GED testing service website as well.
So we hope today's webinar has provided you with a little bit of a look at what a scorable 0 versus a 2 is and where we need to head as we go forward. And we're going to leave you today with a quote that comes from a Florida graduate, actually a 2014 graduate, and her comment is, don't just sit around and think about it, get up and do it. And so on behalf of IPDAY, Susan and I would like to thank you for being with us, because as fellow educators, that's what it really is about, is that we get up and we continue to do new things that are going to assist all of our students. So thank you very much for being with us today, and we'll see you in June.